The fire crackled low in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the weathered face of Silas Blackwood. At 72, his hands were gnarled like old oak roots, but his eyes still held that peculiar intensity that comes from having witnessed both the worst and best of humanity. His grandson Henry sat cross-legged on the floor, 12 years old and hungry for stories the way only the young can be. "Grandpa," the boy said, voice barely above a whisper, "tell me about the shot, the one that changed everything." Silas smiled, a slow pulling at the corners of his mouth that spoke of memories both painful and precious. He reached for the amber glass of whiskey on the side table, took a measured sip, and let the liquid warmth settle in his chest before speaking. "Son, there are moments in a man's life that define everything that comes after. Days when you stand at a crossroads, and the choice you make echoes through decades. For me, that day came in September of 1876 in a dusty Arizona town called Dry Creek." The old man's eyes grew distant, focusing on something only he could see. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 35 years. "I was 37 then. Not young, not old. Just a man trying to forget." The room seemed to fade as Silas fell into memory, and the story began to unfold like pages turning in an ancient book. Dry Creek, Arizona Territory. September 1876. The town squatted in the Sonoran Desert like a collection of sun-bleached bones, 47 households clinging to existence in a land that showed no mercy to the weak. The afternoon sun hung low and merciless, turning the main street into a river of copper light and shadow. Silas Blackwood stood at his forge, hammer in hand, sweat cutting clean lines through the dust on his face. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal had been his companion for 7 years now, ever since he'd fled the ghosts of his past and settled here on the edge of nowhere. He was finishing a horseshoe for the preacher's mare when he heard the sound that would change his life. Shouting, laughter, the kind that carries cruelty in its edges. He set down his hammer, wiped his hands on the leather apron, and walked to the door of his smithy. What he saw made something cold and hard settle in his gut. A crowd had gathered outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, 30, maybe 40 people, most of them drunk despite the early hour. They formed a ragged circle, and at its center stood a young Apache woman. She was bound, hands tied behind her back with manila rope, the kind used for hanging. Her ankles wore iron shackles that Silas knew weighed 12 pounds each because he'd forged similar ones for the territorial marshal. Her dress, made of rough cotton, was torn at the shoulder, revealing skin scraped raw. Dried blood matted her black hair where someone had struck her. On top of her head, balanced with grotesque care, sat a bright red apple. Silas felt his hand drift unconsciously to the Colt single-action army that hung at his hip. The weapon was familiar, worn from use, loaded with 6 rounds as always. He knew its capabilities intimately. At 50 yards, he could split a playing card. But a man's certainty and a man's courage were different animals entirely. Ezekiel Morrison stood at the front of the crowd, arms spread wide like a ringmaster. Zeke owned the largest ranch in the territory, 2,400 acres and 300 head of cattle. But everyone knew he was drowning in debt. $8,500 owed to the Tucson Bank, with no way to pay. "Gentlemen," Zeke's voice carried across the street, oil smooth and venomous. "Here's your entertainment for the afternoon. Whoever shoots that apple clean off gets the girl. Free and clear. Worth $200 if you sell her right." The crowd roared approval. Men stumbled forward, emboldened by whiskey and the particular cruelty that comes when law is absent. The sheriff had died 3 weeks prior, thrown from his horse in a drunken stupor, and the town hadn't bothered to replace him. The nearest law was 80 miles north in Tucson, and nobody was riding that far to complain about the fate of one Apache woman. Silas watched as Luther Kane stepped forward. Kane was a known gunman with 7 kills to his name and a reputation that stretched from Texas to California. He carried a Remington .44 caliber, pearl-handled and polished to a meerschaum. The man's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Kane raised his weapon slowly, making a show of it, milking the crowd's attention. The woman didn't flinch. She stood straight, chin up, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, beyond the town, perhaps beyond this life entirely. In that moment, Silas saw something in her face that cut through the years and landed like a knife in his chest. Composure. In the face of certain death, she maintained her composure with a strength that cut him to the core. Hold it. The word came from Silas's mouth before his brain had fully processed the decision. The crowd turned, surprised, and suddenly he was walking forward, boots grinding dust, pushing through bodies that smelled of sweat and alcohol and malice. Luther Kane lowered his weapon, eyes narrowing. Blackwood, this ain't your concern. It is now, Silas said. His voice was level, calm, the way it had been during the war when giving orders meant the difference between men living and dying. Zeke Morrison's face twisted with annoyance. You got no right, Smith. She's legal salvage, caught stealing from my stores. Apache got no papers, no protection. Silas stopped 10 feet from the woman. Up close, he could see the fear she was fighting to hide. Her breath came quick and shallow. A thin line of blood trickled from where the rope had cut into her wrists. She was maybe 25, younger than he'd first thought. Territorial law of 1863 abolished slavery, Silas said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She's a free citizen under federal jurisdiction. Zeke spat in the dust. She's a savage. Law don't cover her kind. Then let's settle this by your rules, Silas said. He unholstered his Colt, held it up for all to see. I'll take the shot. If I make it, she goes free. The crowd went quiet. They knew Silas Blackwood by reputation, knew he'd been a military judge during the war, knew he kept to himself, worked his forge, spoke to no one unless necessary. But they also knew that quiet men could be the most dangerous when pushed. Your funeral, Zeke said with a shrug, but his eyes glittered with malice. If Silas missed, he'd be the one facing charges. If he killed the woman, no man in Dry Creek would ever forget it. Silas checked his weapon with practiced efficiency. Cylinder full, 6 rounds, hammer smooth, barrel clean. The distance was 75 feet, further than he liked but manageable. Wind from the southeast at about 8 miles per hour. Sun low and to the west, creating glare but not impossible. He looked at the woman then, really looked at her. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw something that made his chest tighten. Not pleading, not begging, just a simple acknowledgement. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't run. She wouldn't cry, she would face it standing, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, that mattered. What's your name? He asked quietly. She hesitated, then spoke. Her voice was rough from thirst but clear. Ayita. He nodded once. Ayita, don't move. Silas raised the Colt, felt the familiar weight settle into his palm. The crowd faded, the noise faded. There was only the sight picture, the target, the mathematics of distance and wind, and the slight tremor in his own hand that he forced into stillness. He thought of Private James Keller, 19 years old, executed by firing squad because Judge Silas Blackwood had signed the death warrant. 3 weeks later, they'd found Keller's journal, found the truth. The boy hadn't deserted. He'd been saving civilians from a burning building. But by then it was too late. The boy was dead, and Silas carried the weight of that injustice like a stone around his neck. 17 men he'd sentenced to death during the war. 3 of them innocent. 3 lives he could never give back. But today he could save 1. Silas exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger with steady pressure, and fired. The sound split the air like thunder. The apple exploded into 2 perfect halves, both tumbling to the dust in opposite directions. The echo rang down the street, bounced off buildings, and faded into stunned silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the crowd erupted. Cheers, curses, disbelief. Men slapped each other's backs, money changed hands on bets nobody knew had been made. Zeke Morrison's face went purple with rage, but the law of his own game bound him. She's yours, Blackwood, he spat. By right of the shot, she's yours. Silas didn't respond. He walked straight to Aida, drew his Bowie knife with its 10-inch blade, and with one clean stroke cut the manila rope binding her wrists. The cord fell away, leaving angry red welts in the skin. She flexed her fingers once slowly, as if testing whether freedom was real. He knelt, unlocked the iron shackles using the key he took from the guard. The metal clanged as it hit the ground, 12 pounds of iron that had cut grooves into her ankles. Only then did Silas notice the blood, a single drop trickling from Aida's left ear. The bullet had passed so close it had grazed her skin. A quarter inch to the right, and she would be dead. She noticed him staring and touched the blood with her fingertips. When she saw the red on her hand, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, something closer to wonder. She had expected to die, had made peace with it, and now she was alive. "Come on," Silas said quietly. He placed a hand on her arm, gentle but firm, and began walking toward his horse. The crowd parted, some cheering, some muttering. Luther Kane stood to the side, hand resting on his gun, eyes promising future violence. Marshal Owen Fletcher stood near the saloon steps, a tall man with gray in his beard, watching with an expression Silas couldn't read. Owen had been a friend once during the war. Now he was just another officer trying to keep order in a lawless land. They passed the last building of Dry Creek, and the noise of the town began to fade behind them. Aida walked beside Silas, not behind him, her steps uneven but determined. She glanced back once at the town that had tried to make a game of her death, then forward again, jaw set. When they were a quarter mile out, following the ruts of the wagon road east, she spoke. "Why did you save me?" Her English was better than he'd expected, accented but clear. Someone had taught her, a missionary perhaps, before everything went wrong. Silas kept walking, didn't look at her when he answered. "Because I couldn't watch it happen." "You don't know me." "No." "You owe me nothing." "No." She stopped walking. He stopped too, turned to face her. Up close, without the crowd and the noise, he could see the toll the last weeks had taken. Bruises in various stages of healing. Cuts that had scabbed over. The hollow look of someone who'd been starved systematically. "You're going to sell me somewhere else," she said. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with the flat certainty of someone who had learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Silas shook his head slowly. "No." "Then what?" He considered how to answer, how to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. Finally he said, "I was a judge once, during the war. I sentenced 17 men to death. 3 of them were innocent, but I didn't know it until after they were gone. I couldn't save them. But today I could save you." Aida studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception, for the trap she'd learned to expect from white men. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied something, because the rigid tension in her shoulders eased slightly. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we walk," Silas said. "I have a cabin about 12 miles northeast. We'll camp tonight by the Santa Cruz River. Reach the cabin tomorrow. You'll be safe there." Safe. She said the word like she was tasting it, testing its weight. "I don't remember what that feels like." They walked on as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. Behind them, Dry Creek faded into the desert haze. Ahead, the mountains rose dark against the dying light. Silas didn't know it yet, but that single shot, that one moment of choosing courage over comfort, had set in motion something that would ripple through decades, would create a family, a legacy, a story that would be told and retold until it became something more than memory. But for now, there was only the sound of boots on hard earth, the cry of a distant hawk, and 2 people walking toward an uncertain future with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a shared understanding that sometimes doing the right thing was more important than staying safe. The sun touched the horizon, and in the last golden light of that September day, Silas Blackwood and Aida disappeared into the vastness of the Arizona territory, leaving behind a town that would not soon forget what had happened. And in the gathering darkness, Luther Kane stood watching them go, hand resting on his gun, already planning his revenge. The Santa Cruz River ran shallow in September, little more than a silver thread winding through cottonwood and mesquite. Silas chose a spot on the eastern bank where the trees formed a natural windbreak, and the ground rose slightly, protection against flash floods that could turn a dry wash into a torrent in minutes. He worked in silence, gathering deadwood, arranging stones for a fire ring. Aida stood 15 feet away, watching his every movement with the wariness of a wild animal ready to bolt. Her hands hung loose at her sides, but Silas noticed how her weight stayed forward on the balls of her feet, ready to run. He built the fire using the bow drill method, cottonwood spindle against a juniper board, friction generating the ember that he transferred to a nest of dried grass. The first thin curl of smoke rose into the evening air. He fed it carefully, twigs first, then larger pieces until flames caught and held. Only when the fire was established did he speak. "There's jerky in my pack. Cornbread too, though it's gone hard. You should eat." Aida didn't move. "Why are you being kind to me?" "Because it's the right thing to do. In my experience, doing the right thing always has a price." Silas looked at her then, really looked, and saw the truth written in every line of her body. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, probably multiple times. He pulled the food from his saddlebag, set it on a flat rock between them, then moved back to his side of the fire. "Eat or don't, your choice. But we've got 12 miles tomorrow, and you'll need your strength." She waited until he turned away, busying himself with his bedroll before she moved. He heard the soft scrape of her feet on stone, the rustle of the food being taken. When he glanced back, she was already retreating to her spot, chewing the jerky slowly, as if afraid it might be snatched away. Silas spread his wool blanket on the ground near the fire, then pulled a second one from his pack. He tossed it across the flames. It landed near her feet. "Gets cold after midnight," he said. "River Valley pulls the temperature down." Aida stared at the blanket like it might be a trap. "Where will you sleep?" "Right here, about 20 feet from you." He pointed to his own blanket. "I'll keep the fire going. You rest." "You could do anything while I sleep." "I could," he agreed, "but I won't." She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders but didn't lie down. Just sat there, watching him across the flames, muscles tense, ready to react. Silas understood. Trust wasn't given freely when every man you'd encountered for 4 years had proven untrustworthy. He settled onto his own blanket, adjusted his Colt so it rested within easy reach, and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, not yet, but to give her the illusion of privacy. Behind his eyelids, memory rose like water through cracked earth. Fort Union, New Mexico, winter of 1864. Silas had been 25 then, newly appointed as a military judge, proud of his position and certain of his righteousness. The Union Army needed order, needed discipline, and he was there to provide it. The court-martial proceedings were straightforward. Private James Keller, age 19, charged with desertion in the face of the enemy. The evidence seemed clear. Keller had abandoned his post during a Confederate assault. 3 soldiers testified they'd seen him run. The defense argued he'd been moving to help wounded civilians caught in the crossfire, but there were no survivors to confirm it. The civilians had died. Keller's story couldn't be verified. Silas had reviewed the case for 6 hours, had weighed every word of testimony. In the end, duty demanded a verdict. Guilty as charged, sentence, death by firing squad at dawn. He'd signed the order with a steady hand, believing he was serving justice. 23 days later, a patrol found Keller's journal in the ruins of a burned homestead. The entries were clear. Keller had seen a family trapped in their house, flames spreading. He'd left his position, pulled 3 people from the fire, tried to get them to safety. They died from burns and smoke inhalation before he could reach the medical tent. He'd been running back to his post when soldiers arrested him. The boy had been a hero, and Silas had killed him. He'd resigned his commission the next day. Couldn't look at another defendant without seeing Keller's face. Couldn't sign another document without feeling the weight of that signature. For 12 years now, he'd carried it. The knowledge that his certainty had murdered an innocent man. Margaret, his wife, had tried to understand, but the shadow of it poisoned everything. When she and their son Daniel died of diphtheria 3 years ago, Silas had wondered if it was punishment. Divine retribution for the lives he'd taken with a pen stroke. He'd stopped believing in God after that. Stopped believing in much of anything except the simple mathematics of metalwork. Heat plus pressure plus time equals shape. No moral ambiguity in a horseshoe. Until today. Until he'd seen Aida standing there with an apple on her head, maintaining her dignity, while men laughed at the prospect of her death. In that moment, something had cracked open inside him. Not redemption, nothing so clean. Just the raw need to prevent one more injustice while he still had the power to act. A sound pulled him from memory. He opened his eyes to find Aida lying down now, blanket pulled tight around her body, but still watching him across the flames. "You said you were a judge," she said quietly. "You killed innocent people?" Silas sat up, fed another piece of wood to the fire. Sparks rose into the darkness like prayers with nowhere to go. "Yes, 3 men that I know of, maybe more that I never learned about. Why did you do it? Because I thought I was serving justice. I was wrong. Aida was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. 4 years ago, soldiers came to my village. Chiricahua Band, 83 people. They said we'd attacked a wagon train. We hadn't. It was white men dressed like Apache, trying to make us look guilty. But the soldiers didn't care about truth. They cared about orders. She paused, and Silas could hear the control it took to keep her voice steady. They killed everyone. Old people, children, babies. My father was a warrior. He tried to stop them. They shot him in front of me. My mother ran to him. They shot her too. My brother was 12. My sister was 9. Where were you? Hunting deer 5 miles away. By the time I heard the gunshots and got back, the village was burning. Bodies everywhere, blood in the river. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her throat. I hid in the rocks, watched the soldiers ride away. Then I buried my family, all of them. It took me 3 days. Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. I'm sorry. Are you? Your people did it. Maybe you even signed the order. I never signed orders against the Apache, but I signed plenty of other orders that were just as wrong. He met her eyes across the flames. If I could take them back, I would. But I can't. All I can do is try not to make the same mistakes. Is that what I am? Your attempt at redemption? No, Silas said quietly. You're a person who deserved better than what Dry Creek was going to give you. That's all. Aida studied him for a long time, firelight painting shadows across her face. Finally, she said, How many Apache did you sentence to death? The question landed like a physical blow. Silas had to think back through the fog of 12 years and hundreds of cases. 4, maybe 5. I don't remember all the names. Were they guilty? I thought so at the time. Now? He shook his head. I don't know. Probably some were. Probably some weren't. The system didn't care much about certainty where Indians were concerned. So you killed my people, and now you save me. That's supposed to balance? No, nothing balances, but maybe it's better than letting you die when I could prevent it. Aida lay back down, turning away from him, presenting her back. I don't forgive you. I'm not asking you to. Good, because I won't. But despite her words, despite the anger in her voice, she didn't leave, didn't run into the darkness. She stayed there by the fire, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her, and eventually her breathing deepened into something that might have been sleep. Silas stayed awake, feeding the fire, watching the stars wheel overhead. A coyote called from somewhere in the hills, answered by another further away. The river murmured its endless conversation with the stones. He thought about tomorrow, about bringing Aida to his cabin, about what it would mean to have another person in the space he'd made his refuge from humanity. The cabin was small, rough, built for one man who didn't expect company and didn't want it. But it had walls, a roof, a bed, more than she'd had in months, probably years. What happened after that, he didn't know. Couldn't plan for it. Could only take things one day at a time and try not to make things worse. Around midnight, Aida cried out in her sleep. A wordless sound of distress that cut through the night. Silas tensed but didn't move. Didn't go to her. She thrashed once, twice, then subsided back into stillness. Whatever demons haunted her dreams, he couldn't fight them for her. But he could keep the fire burning. Could keep watch while she rested. Could be there when morning came. It was something. Not much, but something. Dawn broke pink and gold over the Rincon Mountains. Silas woke Aida gently from a distance, not wanting to startle her. She sat up slowly, eyes scanning the camp with the automatic wariness of someone who'd learned that mornings often brought new dangers. We should move, Silas said. 12 miles to the cabin. We can make it by mid-afternoon if we start now. They ate the last of the cornbread in silence, drank from the river, and set out northeast following game trails that wound through Mesquite and Palo Verde. The land here was harsh, beautiful in its brutality, all thorns and survival. Aida walked beside him now instead of behind, and Silas noticed how her eyes tracked everything. The print of a javelin in soft soil, the flight pattern of a hawk circling overhead, The distant smudge that might be dust from riders or might be wind devils spinning across the flats. You know this land, he said. Not a question. I've lived in it for 4 years. You learn or you die. How did you survive? After your village. She was quiet for a while, picking her way around a stand of cholla cactus, each pad bristling with spines. When she finally spoke, her voice was matter-of-fact, reciting history instead of living it. First month I wanted to die. Thought about walking into the desert without water, letting the sun finish what the soldiers started. But my father's voice kept coming back. He used to say that as long as you breathe, you fight. So I fought. Fought how? Stole food from ranches, slept in caves, moved every few days so nobody could track me. Other Apache bands wouldn't take me in. They said I was cursed, that death followed me. Maybe they were right. You're not cursed, Silas said. How would you know? Because you survived 4 years alone in country that kills men with weapons and horses. That's not a curse. That's strength. Aida glanced at him, something shifting in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of reassessment. They walked through the heat of midday, pausing only to rest in the shade of an ironwood tree and drink from Silas's canteen. Around 2 in the afternoon, the cabin came into view. It sat at the base of a low ridge, built from ponderosa pine logs chinked with adobe, 24 feet by 16 with a corrugated tin roof and a stone chimney. Beside it stood the forge, a separate structure of stone and brick, and beyond that a small corral where 2 horses grazed. This is it, Silas said. Not much, but it's solid. Aida stared at the cabin like she was seeing a mirage. You live here alone? For 7 years now, since Margaret and Daniel died. Your wife and son. Yes. What killed them? Diphtheria. They died 3 days apart. I buried them on the hill behind the cabin. He pointed to a spot where 2 white crosses stood against the sky. I talk to them sometimes. They don't answer, but it helps. Aida looked at the crosses, then at Silas, then back at the cabin. Why are you telling me this? So you understand. I know what it's like to lose everyone. Maybe not exactly the same way you lost them, but I know the shape of that hole. They approached the cabin slowly. Silas opened the door, gestured for her to enter first. She hesitated on the threshold, clearly torn between curiosity and caution. Inside, the space was simple. A cast-iron stove in one corner, a wooden table with 2 chairs, shelves holding canned beans, flour, salt, sugar, tools hung on nails. A bed against the back wall with a wool blanket folded at its foot, and on the table, a photograph in a wooden frame. A woman and a young boy, both smiling. Aida picked up the photograph, handled it carefully. She was beautiful. Yes. And your son looked like you. He had my eyes, his mother's smile. Aida set the photograph down gently, exactly where she'd found it. She turned in a slow circle, taking in every detail. When she faced him again, her expression was guarded. Where do I sleep? The bed is yours. I'll take the floor near the stove. No. She shook her head firmly. You're the owner. I'm the guest. I sleep on the floor. Aida, you've been sleeping on the ground for 4 years. One night in a bed won't kill me. I'm not worthy of it. The words came out flat, automatic, and Silas recognized them for what they were. Not humility, but the internalized poison of being treated as less than human for too long. He kept his voice gentle but firm. In this house, you're not property. You're not a servant. You're a guest, and guests get the bed. That's the rule, not up for debate. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the trap, for the moment when kindness would transform into something uglier. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she gave a single, slight nod. Thank you. You're welcome. They stood there in the quiet cabin, afternoon light slanting through the window, and for the first time since the shot in Dry Creek, Silas felt something other than grim determination. Not quite hope, nothing so presumptuous, just the faint possibility that maybe somehow this strange arrangement might actually work. The first week passed in careful choreography, 2 people learning to share space without collision. Silas rose before dawn each day, stoked the fire, and headed to the forge while Aida still slept. She would wake to the distant ring of hammer on anvil, a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat, and find water already heated on the stove, cornmeal set out for breakfast. She moved through the cabin like a ghost at first, touching nothing without permission, eating only what was explicitly offered. But gradually, imperceptibly, things shifted. On the third day, Silas came in from the forge to find the floor swept clean. On the fifth day, the shelves had been reorganized with a logic he hadn't considered, but immediately appreciated. On the seventh day, he smelled something cooking that wasn't his usual bland fare. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the pot on the stove. "Acorn bread," Ayita said. She didn't look at him, focused on the work. "I found oak trees by the river, gathered acorns, leached the tannins, ground the meal. Apache way." Silas watched her work, the efficiency of her movements, the centuries of knowledge compressed into the simple act of making bread. When she pulled the loaf from the Dutch oven, the smell filled the cabin with something warm and almost forgotten. Home. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the wary quiet of strangers, but something approaching companionship. That night, as firelight flickered across the walls, Ayita spoke without prompting. "You asked how I survived. I didn't tell you everything." Silas looked up from the harness he was mending. "You don't owe me your story." "I know, but I want to tell it. Part of it anyway." She stared into the flames. "After the massacre, I was alone for almost a year. Then I met other Apache, a small band moving through. They took me in for a while. 3 months. What happened? They said I brought bad luck. Said the spirits were angry because I'd survived when I shouldn't have. They left me while I was sleeping, took everything I had except the clothes I wore." She touched the leather bracelet on her wrist absently. "This belonged to my sister, 9 years old. She made it the week before the soldiers came." Silas set down the harness. "I'm sorry." "For what? You didn't leave me." "No, but my people created the conditions that made all of it possible." Ayita looked at him then, really looked, and something in her eyes had changed. Not softness exactly, but perhaps a willingness to see him as an individual, rather than a representative of every white man who'd wronged her. "You're different," she said quietly. "Most white men, they look at me and see either an animal or a thing to use. You look at me and see a person. That's because you are one." Simple words, but I haven't heard them in a long time. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, a nighthawk called its strange mechanical cry. Inside, two damaged people sat in the warm glow and allowed themselves the dangerous luxury of beginning to trust. On the eighth day, Marshal Owen Fletcher arrived. Silas was working the bellows, heating iron for a wagon axle repair, when he heard the horse approaching. He emerged from the forge to find Owen dismounting, dust coating his dark coat, lines of weariness carved deep around his eyes. "Owen," Silas said carefully. They'd been friends once during the war when both of them still believed in clear lines between right and wrong. "This official or personal?" "Both." Owen tied his horse to the rail, turned to face Silas with the expression of a man carrying news he didn't want to deliver. "We need to talk." They walked away from the cabin, out of Aida's earshot. Owen pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, but didn't hand it over immediately. "Zeke Morrison filed a claim with the territorial office. Says the Apache woman has stolen property. Says he has documentation proving legal ownership." Silas felt something cold settle in his gut. What kind of documentation? "A bill of sale. Claims he purchased her from an Apache chief named Red Eagle 6 months ago for $200 in goods." "That's a lie." "Probably, but it's a documented lie, signed and witnessed. Until a circuit judge can review it, the paper has legal standing." "When does the judge arrive?" Owen hesitated. 3 weeks, maybe 4. "And until then?" "Until then, technically, you're in possession of disputed property. Zeke wants her returned pending resolution." Silas felt his hand drift toward his Colt, then forced it back to neutral. "She's not property, Owen. She's a human being." "I know that, you know that, but the law out here is fuzzy on the subject, especially where Indians are concerned." Owen finally handed over the paper. "I'm supposed to serve you this notice and escort the woman back to Dry Creek for holding." "You're not taking her." "Silas, don't make this harder than it has to be. I said you're not taking her." The words came out flat, final. "She stays here, under my protection. If Zeke wants her, he can come get her himself. Owen studied his old friend's face, saw the immovable determination there, and sighed. You know what you're starting? Zeke's got money, connections. He'll come for her, and he won't come alone. Let him come. You can't fight off a whole gang, Silas. Be reasonable. Reason is what got James Keller killed. I followed reason, followed procedure, followed the law, and I murdered an innocent boy. Silas's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. I won't make that mistake again. Aida stays. Owen was quiet for a long moment, weighing duty against friendship, law against conscience. Finally, he folded the notice and tucked it back in his coat. I didn't find you home. Cabin was empty when I arrived. That's what my report will say. He moved toward his horse, then paused. But Silas, this buys you maybe 3 days. After that, Zeke will come, and he's already hired guns. Luther Kane is gathering men from Tucson. How many? 8 so far, maybe more. Silas absorbed this information without visible reaction. Thanks for the warning. Just... Owen swung into the saddle, looked down at his friend with something close to desperation. Don't die for this, Silas. She's not worth it. That's where you're wrong, Silas said quietly. She's exactly worth it. Owen rode away, dust rising in his wake, and Silas stood watching until horse and rider disappeared into the shimmer of heat haze. Then he turned back toward the cabin, already cataloging what needed to be done. Aida stood in the doorway. She'd heard everything. You should give me to them, she said. No emotion in her voice, just flat pragmatism. I'm not worth dying for. Let me decide what I'm willing to teach for. Why? Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know? Silas walked past her into the cabin, began pulling weapons from their storage. 2 rifles, a shotgun, boxes of ammunition. He set them on the table with methodical care. Because 17 years ago I had a choice. I could risk my career, my position, maybe my freedom to stand up for Private Keller, or I could follow procedure and sign his death warrant. He met her eyes. I chose procedure, I chose safety, and it's haunted me every day since. So this is about your guilt. No, this is about not making the same mistake twice. He checked the action on the Winchester repeating rifle, found it smooth. We have 3 days to prepare, maybe less. You can leave if you want. I won't stop you, or you can stay and fight. Aida looked at the weapons on the table, then at Silas, then out the window toward the empty desert that had been her prison for 4 years. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I'm tired of running. If they come, I fight. You know how to shoot? My father taught me, before. She didn't finish the sentence. Silas handed her the shotgun, a double-barreled 12-gauge. Show me. They spent the afternoon turning the cabin into a fortress. Silas nailed thick pine boards across the windows, leaving narrow gaps for rifle fire. They dug a shallow trench around the perimeter, not deep enough to stop a determined assault, but sufficient to slow attackers and provide warning. Aida proved surprisingly adept with the shotgun, her aim steady, her movements economical. Where did you really learn to shoot? Silas asked after she'd put 5 shots in a tight grouping. I told you, my father, he said Apache women needed to be warriors too, because the men weren't always there to protect them. Sadness flickered across her face. He was right about that. They worked until sunset, stopping only when the light failed. Inside the cabin, Silas lit the oil lamp and spread a map on the table. He marked the approaches to the property, the sight lines, the places where attackers would likely stage. If they come at night, we'll have the advantage of position, he said, tracing potential fields of fire with his finger. But if they're smart, they'll wait for dawn when the sun's in our eyes. How long can we hold? Depends on how many come. 8 men with rifles? If they rush us, maybe an hour. If they lay siege, we've got water from the well, food for 2 weeks, could outlast them if they lose patience. They won't lose patience, Aida said quietly. Men like Zeke Morrison, they can't let this go. It's not about me anymore. It's about pride. Silas knew she was right. The moment he'd stepped into that circle in Dry Creek, the moment he'd fired that shot, he'd challenged something deeper than law. He'd challenged the assumption that men like Zeke could do whatever they wanted to people like Aida without consequence. That night, neither of them slept much. Silas sat by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the darkness for movement. Aida lay on the bed, but her breathing never deepened into the rhythm of true sleep. Around midnight, she spoke from the darkness. Silas? Yeah? If this goes badly, if they kill you because of me, I want you to know something. What's that? In 4 years, you're the first person to treat me like I matter. Whatever happens, that means something. Silas didn't know how to respond to that, so he said the only thing that felt true. You do matter. Maybe, but the world doesn't usually agree. The next 2 days passed in tense preparation. They reinforced the doors with crossbeams, moved supplies closer to defensive positions, cleaned weapons until they gleamed. On the second day, Miriam Holt arrived, the widow who ran the boarding house in Dry Creek. She brought food, ammunition, and information. They're gathering tonight, she said, setting a basket of bread on the table. Luther Kane has 12 men now. They plan to ride at dawn tomorrow. 12, Silas repeated. You're sure? I counted them myself, saw them at the saloon drinking and making plans. Miriam looked at Aida, her expression unreadable. Some of the women in town, we don't think this is right. What Zeke's doing. But we can't stop it. You came here, Aida said. That's something. It's not enough. Miriam pulled a small derringer from her bag, set it on the table. But if you need one more gun, I can shoot. Silas shook his head gently. Miriam, I appreciate it, but I won't put you in danger. Too late. I'm already in it. She glanced between them. My husband died fighting for something he believed in. Seems like a waste if I don't do the same. In the end, Silas accepted her help. 3 guns were better than 2, and Miriam's presence seemed to steady something in Aida, the knowledge that not all white women saw her as less than human. That evening, as the sun painted the mountains gold and crimson, the 3 of them sat on the cabin's small porch. For a few minutes, watching the desert settle into twilight, they could almost pretend this was normal. Just 3 people sharing a meal, watching the day end. Then Silas saw it, a flash of light from the ridge, there and gone. Someone with field glasses, catching the last rays of sun. They were being watched. Scouted, the attack would come soon. Inside, he said quietly, it's time. They moved into the cabin, barred the door, took their positions at the windows. Aida checked her shotgun one last time. Miriam gripped the derringer with hands that shook slightly but didn't waver. Silas looked at these 2 women, one he'd known for years, one he'd known for barely a week, both willing to stand with him against impossible odds. He thought about choices, about the moments that define a life, about how strange it was that shooting an apple off a woman's head could lead to this. Whatever happens, he said, thank you. Both of you. Aida met his eyes across the dim room. Don't thank us yet. Wait until we're still breathing on the other side. Outside, the desert night deepened. Stars emerged one by one, cold and distant. And somewhere in that darkness, 12 men rode closer, bringing violence and the reckoning Silas had known would come from the moment he pulled the trigger in Dry Creek. The only question now was whether his choice to save one life would cost him his own. The attack came at 4 in the morning, that dead hour when the body craves sleep most desperately and the mind plays tricks in the darkness. Silas had been dozing against the wall, rifle cradled in his arms, when the first tripwire bell rang. His eyes snapped open. Across the room, Aida was already moving, shotgun in hand, barefoot and silent. Miriam stirred from her position near the pier window, derringer clutched tight. East side, Silas whispered. Someone hit the wire near the well. He moved to the firing slit he'd cut in the window boards, pressed his eye to the gap. Moonlight painted the landscape in silver and shadow. For 30 seconds, nothing moved. Then he saw it, a darker shadow separating from the base of a mesquite tree, advancing in a crouch. The shape of Luther Kane was unmistakable even at 60 yards. The man moved with the confidence of someone who'd killed before and expected to kill again. I count 4 on the east approach, Silas murmured. Aida, check the north window. Miriam, south. Aida pressed against the wall, peered through her gap. 3 on the north, maybe 4. Hard to tell in the shadows. 5 on the south, Miriam's voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. They're spreading out, trying to surround us. 12 men total, just as Miriam had warned. Silas did the mathematics quickly. They had perhaps 40 rounds of rifle ammunition, 20 shotgun shells, and 6 shots in the Derringer. If it came to a sustained firefight, they'd run dry long before the attackers did. "Listen to me," Silas said quietly. "We don't fire unless we have clear targets. Make every shot count. If they rush us, aim for center mass. Don't try to be fancy." Luther Kane's voice cut through the darkness, amplified by the desert silence. "Blackwood, send the woman out and we'll let you live. You've got 60 seconds to decide." Silas didn't respond. Words were wasted on men who'd already chosen violence. 50 seconds, Blackwood." Aida glanced at Silas, her face unreadable in the dim light. "Last chance, you can still give me up." "Not happening." Stubborn white man. Stubborn Apache woman. Despite everything, despite the guns and the darkness and the men outside wanting them dead, Aida's mouth curved in something that might have been a smile. 40 seconds! Silas raised his Winchester, settled the stock against his shoulder. Through the gap, he could see Kane gesturing to his men, positioning them. This was it, the moment when talk ended and lead began to fly. "Time's up, Blackwood. You made your choice." The first shot came from the south, a rifle crack that punched through the wall 6 inches above Miriam's head. She ducked instinctively, then steadied herself and returned fire through her slit. The Derringer's sharp report seemed pathetically small against the thunder of rifles. Then all 12 guns opened up at once. The cabin erupted in splinters and dust. Bullets punched through the pine boards, whined off the iron stove, shattered the oil lamp, and plunged the interior into darkness. Silas fired 3 times in rapid succession, saw one attacker stumble and fall. Aida's shotgun boomed, the spread of pellets catching someone in the leg. A scream pierced the night. "Reload," Silas barked. His fingers worked automatically, ejecting spent brass, feeding fresh rounds into the Winchester's magazine. 17 years since the war, but the muscle memory remained. The second wave hit harder. Someone on the east side tried to rush the door. Silas put 2 rounds through the wood at chest height. A body hit the ground with a heavy thud. "Got one," he said grimly. But the attackers were learning. Instead of a frontal assault, they'd shifted to suppressing fire, keeping the defenders' heads down while other men maneuvered closer. Silas caught movement at the edge of his vision, someone climbing onto the forge roof for a better angle. "Aida! Roof!" She swung the shotgun up, fired through a gap in the ceiling boards. The blast echoed like thunder in the confined space. A body rolled off the roof, landed with a sickening crunch. 2 down, Aida said. Her voice was calm, almost detached, and Silas realized she'd done this before. Maybe not exactly this, but something close. Combat was familiar territory for her. Then he saw Zeke Morrison, hanging back behind a water trough, directing his men like a general who had no intention of risking his own skin. The rancher's face was twisted with rage and something else, humiliation. Every moment this fight continued was another blow to his pride, another story that would spread through the territory about how he couldn't take 1 man and 2 women. "Burn them out," Zeke shouted. "Torch the cabin." Silas felt his blood go cold. Fire. He should have anticipated that, should have prepared for it. The roof was tin, but the walls were pine, dry as tinder after months without rain. A flaming bottle arced through the air, struck the north wall, shattered in a spray of kerosene. Flames licked up the boards immediately. Another bottle from the south, then a third from the east. "We've got to move," Miriam said, coughing as smoke began to fill the cabin. "We can't stay here." Silas's mind raced. The cabin was becoming a death trap, but stepping outside meant exposing themselves to 10 rifles. Either way led to the same destination. Then Aida grabbed his arm, pulled him close. "The tunnel." "What tunnel?" "I found it 3 days ago, behind the bed. Old escape route, maybe from when Apache raided this area. I didn't tell you because I thought you'd be angry I was exploring." "Show me, now." Aida dropped to her knees behind the bed, felt along the wall until she found the loose board. It pulled away, revealing a dark opening, barely 2 feet wide. The smell of earth and age wafted out. "Where does it go?" Silas asked. "I don't know. I didn't go far, but it's away from here." Outside, the attackers were getting bolder, sensing victory. Gunfire intensified. Part of the roof caught fire, flames spreading across the tin with eerie blue flickers. "Miriam, you first," Silas ordered. "Then Aida, I'll cover the rear." Miriam hesitated. "Silas, if we all go in there and they find the entrance, we're trapped. And if we stay here, we're dead for certain. Move." Miriam squeezed into the tunnel, her dress catching on rough stone. Aida followed, moving with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in tight spaces. Silas fired 3 more rounds through the window, buying seconds, then threw himself into the opening. The tunnel was narrow, low, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through absolute darkness. Silas could hear Aida ahead of him, her breathing steady despite the confined space. Behind them, the roar of flames grew louder. They crawled for what felt like hours but was probably minutes. Silas's shoulders scraped stone on both sides. His knees found every sharp rock. Ahead, he heard Miriam gasp, "I feel air." "There's an opening." The tunnel angled upward sharply. Miriam scrambled out first, then helped pull Aida up. Silas emerged last, sucking in clean air, trying to orient himself. They were on the far side of the ridge, maybe 200 yards from the cabin. From here, they could see the structure fully engulfed, flames reaching 30 feet into the sky. Silhouettes moved around it, darker shadows against the orange glow. "They think we're dead," Aida whispered. "Burned alive." "Good," Silas said. "Let them think that." They watched as the cabin's roof collapsed inward with a shower of sparks. 7 years of his life, 7 years of memories and solitude, consumed in minutes. The photographs of Margaret and Daniel, the tools he'd carefully maintained, the bed where his wife had died, all gone. But they were alive. Against ridiculous odds, they were alive. "What now?" Miriam asked. Silas was about to answer when he saw something that made his heart stop. 2 riders approaching from the west, moving fast. More of Zeke's men arriving late to the fight. Except these riders weren't heading for the burning cabin. They were heading straight for Zeke Morrison. The lead rider pulled up hard, dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. Even at this distance, Silas recognized Marshal Owen Fletcher. Owen grabbed Zeke by the shirt, shoved him backward. His voice carried across the desert, sharp with fury. "Federal warrant, Morrison. You're under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and falsifying legal documents." Zeke tried to pull away. "You got no authority here." "The hell I don't." Owen produced a paper, thrust it in Zeke's face. "Judge Carrington signed this 2 hours ago. Your bill of sale was a forgery. The man you claim was an Apache chief? He's a drunk you paid $20 to make his mark on a fake document." The second rider dismounted now, and Silas felt something unlock in his chest. It was Judge Albert Carrington himself, 70 years old and looking like the wrath of God in a black coat. "Mr. Morrison," the judge's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "You are hereby charged with multiple felonies under territorial and federal law. Marshal Fletcher, place this man in irons." Luther Kane stepped forward, hand on his gun. "Judge, you might want to reconsider. We've got 10 men here. You've got 1 marshal." But Owen was smiling now, a cold, dangerous expression. "Look behind you, Kane." Luther turned. Coming over the ridge from 3 directions were riders. 20, 30, 40 of them. Citizens from Dry Creek and the surrounding ranches. Men who'd heard about the judge's ruling and decided that maybe, finally, it was time to stand for something. Kane's hand moved away from his gun very slowly. The judge surveyed the burning cabin, the armed men, the evidence of violence. "Where is Silas Blackwood? Where is the woman?" Owen scanned the darkness, and Silas saw the moment his old friend spotted them on the ridge. Their eyes met across the distance. Owen gave the slightest nod, then turned back to the judge. "The cabin's destroyed, sir. Appears they perished in the fire." Silas understood immediately. Owen was giving them a gift, an escape, a chance to disappear while legal matters sorted themselves out. But before Silas could decide whether to accept that gift, Aida stood up. "No more hiding," she said firmly. "No more running." She began walking down the ridge toward the gathering, silhouetted against the burning cabin, looking like something out of legend. Silas had no choice but to follow, Miriam close behind. The crowd parted as they approached. Men who'd been ready to kill them 5 minutes ago now stepped back, weapons lowered, faces uncertain. Judge Carrington's eyes widened. You're alive. Barely, Silas said. Good. Because I need your testimony. You and Miss... The judge looked at Aida expectantly. Aida, she said clearly. Just Aida. The soldiers killed everyone who knew my family name. The judge's expression softened slightly. Miss Aida, I've reviewed the case. The document Mr. Morrison presented was fraudulent. You were never his property. You are, and have always been, a free citizen under federal law. Aida stood very still, as if afraid that moving might shatter this moment. Free? Completely. Mr. Morrison will face trial for his crimes, as will any man who participated in tonight's attack. The judge's gaze swept the assembled gunmen. I suggest the rest of you depart immediately. Those who leave now won't be charged. Those who remain will be arrested as accomplices. The crowd dissolved like smoke. Men mounted horses and rode into the darkness, wanting no part of what came next. Within minutes, only Zeke Morrison and Luther Kane remained in custody, along with 2 wounded men who couldn't ride. Owen approached Silas, extended his hand. Sorry about your cabin. It's just wood and nails. Silas looked at the ruins, flames dying down to embers now. I can rebuild. With help, Owen said. Half the town's planning to ride out tomorrow with supplies. Seems you made more friends than you knew. Silas glanced at Aida, who stood speaking quietly with Judge Carrington. The firelight caught her face, highlighting the strength in her features, the dignity she'd maintained through everything. Owen, Silas said quietly, when you telegraphed for the judge, when you gathered those men, you were risking your career. Maybe your life. Why so? The marshal was quiet for a moment, watching the last flames flicker and die. Because 17 years ago, we both stood by while an innocent man died. I've carried that as long as you have. Tonight felt like a chance to get it right. They stood in companionable silence, 2 old soldiers who'd finally found a battle worth fighting. Aida returned, her expression unreadable. The judge says I can testify at the trial if I want. Help make sure Zeke Morrison pays for what he tried to do. Will you? Silas asked. Yes, because someone needs to speak for all the others who didn't survive. All the people like me who disappeared without anyone caring. She looked at the smoking ruins. But after that, what happens? Where do I go? Silas realized he'd been thinking about that question since the moment he cut her free in Dry Creek. The answer had been forming slowly, like metal taking shape under careful hammering. You stay, he said simply. We rebuild the cabin, bigger this time, 2 bedrooms. You stay as long as you want, leave whenever you choose. But you'll always have a place here if you need it. Why would you do that? Because I don't have family anymore. Haven't for years, and maybe that's what we both need. Not romance, not obligation, just family. Aida studied his face for a long moment, firelight reflecting in her dark eyes. Then slowly she smiled, a real smile, the first he'd seen from her. Family, she repeated, testing the word. I think I'd like that. The trial lasted 3 days and became the talk of the territory. Judge Carrington presided with iron authority, his white beard and severe expression brooking no nonsense from defense attorneys or spectators. The courtroom in Tucson filled to capacity each morning, people standing in the aisles, pressing against the walls, hungry for drama and justice in equal measure. Silas testified on the first day, recounting the events in Dry Creek with methodical precision. He described the apple, the crowd, the shot, described Zeke Morrison's boast about selling Aida, Luther Kane's eagerness to participate, the whole grotesque spectacle. The defense attorney, a slick man from Phoenix named Hendricks, tried to paint Silas as a troublemaker who'd inserted himself into a lawful transaction. Mr. Blackwood, Hendricks said smoothly, isn't it true that you acted purely on impulse? That you had no knowledge of the legal status of the woman in question? I knew she was human, Silas replied. That was enough. But you're not a lawyer. You couldn't possibly know whether Mr. Morrison's claim was legitimate. I knew that treating a human being like a carnival prize was wrong. I didn't need a law degree to understand that. The gallery erupted in applause. Judge Carrington's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order, I will have order, or I will clear this courtroom. On the second day, Aida took the stand. She wore a simple dress that Miriam Holt had made for her, dark blue cotton with white collar, modest and proper. But nothing could hide the strength in her bearing, the way she held herself like a warrior, even in the unfamiliar setting of a courtroom. The prosecutor, a territorial attorney named Walsh, led her through her testimony gently. She described the massacre of her village, the 4 years of survival that followed, her capture by Zeke Morrison's men. They kept me in a shed, she said, voice steady, fed me once a day, usually spoiled food. When I tried to escape, they beat me. When I refused to work, they withheld water. This went on for 6 weeks before the day in Dry Creek. And what were you thinking, Walsh asked quietly, when they put that apple on your head? Aida was silent for a moment, remembering. I thought about my family, my father, my mother, my brother, and sister. I thought that maybe I would see them soon. I wasn't afraid of dying anymore. I was just tired. What changed? A white man stepped forward, someone who didn't know me, who owed me nothing, who had every reason to walk away. But he didn't walk away. He took the shot. And when the apple fell, I realized something I'd forgotten. That kindness still existed in the world. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Hendricks tried to break her on cross-examination, suggesting she'd been working as Morrison's employee, that she'd stolen from Hinnosem, that the whole affair was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Aida looked at him with eyes that had seen horrors he couldn't imagine, and said simply, "You're calling me a liar." "I'm suggesting your memory might be faulty. My memory is perfect. I remember every face of the soldiers who killed my family. I remember every day of hunger, every night sleeping in caves. I remember the color of the rope that cut my wrists and the weight of the chains on my ankles. 12 pounds. Should I tell you about the scars they left?" Hendricks backed down. On the third day, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. Zeke Morrison received 15 years in territorial prison. Luther Kane got 10. The 2 wounded gunmen who'd participated in the cabin burning received 5 years each. Judge Carrington addressed the courtroom before passing sentence, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "Gentlemen, we stand at a crossroads as a territory and as a nation. The question before us is simple. Are we a land of laws that apply equally to all, or are we a place where might makes right and the vulnerable exist only at the mercy of the powerful?" Today, we have answered that question. Let it be known throughout Arizona territory that human dignity is not negotiable, that freedom is not a privilege extended only to the favored few, but a right inherent in every soul. As they led Morrison away in chains, the rancher looked back at Silas with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Blackwood. I've got family. They'll come for you." "Let them come," Silas replied quietly. Outside the courthouse, Aida stood on the steps in the bright Arizona sun, breathing free air, legally and undeniably a free woman for the first time in 4 years. Silas stood beside her, not touching, just present. "What now?" she asked. "Now we go home, or what's left of Oed." True to Owen Fletcher's word, the people of Dry Creek had rallied. When Silas and Aida returned to the property 3 days after the fire, they found not ruins, but the skeleton of a new cabin rising from the ashes. 20 men worked in organized chaos, sawing lumber, driving nails, calling out measurements and jokes in equal measure. Tommy Wilson, a 14-year-old orphan from town, approached Silas with a hammer in his hand and hope in his eyes. "Mr. Blackwood, sir, Mr. Fletcher said you might need an apprentice at the forge, someone to learn the trade. I'm strong, I work hard, and I don't eat much." Silas saw himself in the boy's face, saw every lost soul looking for purpose, for a place to belong. He looked at Aida, who gave the slightest nod. "You know anything about metalwork, Tommy?" "No, sir, but I learned fast." "Can you take orders without arguing?" "Yes, sir." "Can you keep a secret?" Tommy looked confused. "What kind of secret?" "The kind where you treat Miss Aida with the same respect you'd show any white woman." "Think you can manage that?" The boy glanced at Aida, then back at Silas, understanding dawning. "I can manage that, sir. My ma always said people are people, no matter what they look like. Your ma was a wise woman. You're hired. 25 cents a day plus meals. We'll start tomorrow." The new cabin went up in 2 weeks, larger than the old one. 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, reinforced walls. The community poured its guilt and its hope into those boards, building something that felt like atonement. Aida worked alongside the men, her knowledge of adobe construction proving invaluable. She showed them techniques her people had used for centuries, ways of mixing mud and straw that created walls stronger than wood alone. The men watched skeptically at first, then with growing respect as they saw the results. Miriam Holt came most days, bringing food and conversation. She and Aida formed an unlikely friendship, two women from different worlds finding common ground and shared resilience. "You know what they're saying in town?" Miriam asked one afternoon as they mixed adobe. "I can imagine," Aida replied. "They're saying Silas Blackwood is either the bravest man in the territory or the craziest. Taking in an Apache woman, defending her against Zeke Morrison, losing his cabin for her. What do you think?" Miriam was quiet for a moment, hands working the mud. "I think brave and crazy often look the same from the outside. My husband was both. Got himself killed fighting for the Union, left me alone with two children. I was angry at him for years, but now?" She shook her head. "Now I think the world needs more people who'll risk everything for what's right, even if it costs them. Even if it costs them their lives. Especially then, because those are the stories that change things, the ones that make other people braver." As autumn deepened into winter, life at Blackwood Forge found its rhythm. Silas taught Tommy the basics of metalwork, while Aida managed the household and began teaching reading and writing to children in town. Twice a week, mothers would bring their sons and daughters to the cabin, and Aida would hold lessons in the yard, teaching letters in English and Apache side by side. Some people objected. There were still those who saw Aida as less than human, who muttered about miscegenation and savages. But they muttered quietly now, aware that public sentiment had shifted. Judge Carrington's words had resonated. Silas Blackwood's stand had meant something. On a cold December evening, Silas and Aida sat on the new cabin's porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Tommy was inside, studying by lamplight, determined to learn reading as well as smithing. "I've been thinking," Aida said quietly, about what happens next, for me, for us." Silas waited. Over the months, he had learned that Aida spoke when she was ready, not when prompted. "The judge said I'm free. Free to go anywhere, do anything. I could go to California, start fresh where nobody knows me. I could try to find other Apache, join a reservation." "You could," Silas agreed, keeping his voice neutral despite the tightness in his chest. "But I don't want to." He turned to look at her. In the fading light, her profile was strong, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with character forged in fire. "What do you want?" "I want to stay here, build a life, help you with the forge, teach the children, make this place into something good. Something that honors the people we've lost by helping the people who are still here." "That sounds like a good plan. There's more." She took a breath. "People in town already think we're together. Romantically. The gossip is constant, and I've been thinking that maybe they're not entirely wrong." Silas's heart beat faster. "Aida, you don't owe me anything. If you feel obligated because I helped you, I don't feel obligated. I feel something else. Something I didn't think I'd ever feel again after losing my family. I feel like I've found a home. Not just a place, but a person. Someone who sees me as I am and doesn't ask me to be less than that." She turned to face him fully. "I'm not saying I love you. Not yet. I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore. But I'm saying I want to try, if you do." Silas thought about Margaret, about the love they'd shared and the grief he'd carried when she died. For years, he'd believed that chapter of his life was closed, that he'd had his chance at partnership and wouldn't get another. But sitting here with Aida, watching the stars emerge one by one, he realized that life was longer and stranger than he'd imagined. That second chances came in unexpected forms. "I'd like that," he said simply. "No promises about where it leads, just taking it one day at a time." "One day at a time," she agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the desert. Inside, Tommy called out a question about fractions, and Aida went to help him. Silas stayed on the porch, thinking about the strange path that had led him here. A single shot in Dry Creek. One moment of choosing courage over comfort. And now this, a life being rebuilt from ashes. A future taking shape. 3 weeks later, on a morning when frost painted the desert silver, a rider appeared on the horizon. Silas watched him approach, hand drifting to the rifle that now lived within easy reach. The cabin burning had taught him about vigilance. But as the rider drew closer, Silas recognized him. An old man, maybe 70, thin as a rail, riding a horse that looked equally worn. The man dismounted slowly, joints clearly paining him. He removed his hat, revealing a shock of white hair. "Mr. Blackwood?" "That's me. What can I do for you?" "My name is Michael Keller. I think you knew my son, Private James Keller." The world tilted. Silas felt his breath stop, his vision narrow. The father of the boy he'd sentenced to death stood before him, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from this reckoning. "Mr. Keller, Words failed. What could he possibly say? "I got your letter," the old man continued. "The one you sent 17 years ago. Took me this long to work up the courage to find you." "I'm sorry," Silas managed. "I'm so sorry. I killed your son. I signed in the order that—" "I know what you did. James wrote me before he died, told me not to hate you, said you were just following orders, doing what you thought was right." Michael Keller's eyes were wet, but his voice stayed steady. "It took me 17 years to understand what he meant, to let go of the anger." "Why come here now?" "Because I heard about what you did in Dry Creek, how you saved that Apache woman, how you risked everything for a stranger." The old man smiled sadly. "My son would have done the same thing. He died trying to save strangers from a burning building. You couldn't save him, but you saved her. In a way, that feels right. Like maybe his death meant something after all." Silas felt tears on his face and didn't bother wiping them away. "He was a good man, better than me, better than most." "Yes, he was." Michael reached into his coat, pulled out a pocket watch, gold and worn smooth. "This was his. I want you to have it." "I can't. Please, I'm old, got no other children. When I die, it'll just get sold for scrap. But if you take it, keep it, maybe pass it to your children someday, then part of James lives on. That would mean something to me." Silas took the watch with shaking hands. On the back, an inscription: "To James, be brave, be kind, Papa." "I don't deserve this. None of us deserve most of what we get, good or bad, but I want you to have it anyway." Michael Keller climbed back on his horse, wincing at the effort. "Take care, Mr. Blackwood, and take care of that woman. The world needs more people who'll stand up when it's hard." He rode away slowly, disappearing into the desert haze. Silas stood holding the watch, feeling its weight, understanding that forgiveness came from unexpected places and in forms nobody could predict. Aida emerged from the cabin, saw his tears, and came to stand beside him without asking questions. He showed her the watch, told her about James Keller, about the guilt he'd carried and the grace he'd just received. She took his hand, squeezed it gently. "The past doesn't define us. What we do now, that's what matters." "What we do now," Silas repeated, looking at the watch, at Aida, at the life they were building together. In the distance, Tommy's hammer rang against metal, learning the trade that would carry him forward. Inside the cabin, lesson books waited for the next group of children. And in Silas's hand, a dead boy's watch ticked steadily on, marking seconds that added up to something like redemption. Wyoming Territory, November 1911. The fire in Silas Blackwood's stone hearth had burned down to embers, casting a soft orange glow across the room. At 72, his voice had grown raspy from hours of storytelling, but his eyes still held that peculiar brightness that came when memory grew more vivid than the present. Henry sat motionless on the floor, 12 years old and utterly transfixed. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the first flakes of winter drifting past the window like ghosts. "And that's how I met your grandmother," Silas said, reaching for the glass of water on the side table. "A shot that should have killed her became the shot that saved both our lives." "What happened after?" Henry asked. "After the old man gave you the watch?" Silas smiled, pulled a gold pocket watch from his vest. The metal was worn smooth from decades of handling, the inscription barely visible but still there. "To James, be brave, be kind, Papa." "Life happened, boy, the kind that matters." The door opened and Aida entered, carrying a tray with tea and cornbread. At 60, she moved with the same quiet grace Silas had first noticed in the Arizona desert 35 years ago. Her hair, now streaked with silver, hung in a long braid over one shoulder. Age had softened her features, but not diminished the strength there. "Still telling war stories?" she asked, setting the tray down. "Family stories," Silas corrected. "Same thing in this house." But she smiled as she said it, settling into the chair beside him with the ease of long companionship. Henry looked between them, seeing something he'd always known but never quite articulated. The way his grandfather's hand automatically found his grandmother's. The silent communication that passed in glances. The sense of two people who'd weathered storms together and come out stronger. "Grandpa," Henry said, "you said that was how you met, but how did you end up married? What happened in between?" Silas and Aida exchanged a look. She nodded slightly, giving permission. "The path from meeting to marrying wasn't simple," Silas said. "After Michael Keller left, after I understood that forgiveness was possible, something shifted. Not just in me, but between us. We spent that winter rebuilding more than just the cabin." He fell quiet, remembering. December 1876. The forge rang with steady rhythm as Tommy worked the bellows in Silas-shaped horseshoes for a rancher's order. Outside, Aida taught reading to 6 children huddled in blankets against the cold. Her voice carried through the window, patient and clear, repeating letters until small voices echoed them back. That evening, after Tommy had gone to his quarters above the forge and the children had been collected by their parents, Silas and Aida sat by the fire. The cabin was finished now, solid and warm, but still felt too large for just 2 people and a boy. "I've been thinking about the future," Aida said, working on a beadwork pattern. "About what legacy means. What brought this on?" "The children, teaching them. I see how hungry they are to learn, how much potential sits in those small minds. And I think about my sister. She was 9 when she died. She would have been your age now." Aida paused, fingers stilling on the beadwork. She never got the chance to grow up, to become who she might have been. But those children, they have that chance, and teaching them feels like honoring her memory. Silas understood. He'd felt the same about James Keller's watch, about carrying it forward as a reminder that lives cut short could still have meaning. "You're good with them," he said. "The parents trust you. That's no small thing. They trust me because you vouch for me. Your reputation gives me shelter." "No, they trust you because you've earned it." She looked at him then, firelight catching in her dark eyes. "Celeste, we need to talk about what this is, what we are to each other." His heart rate picked up. They'd been dancing around this conversation for weeks, both aware that their relationship had evolved beyond simple friendship, but neither willing to name it first. "What do you want us to be?" he asked. "I want us to be partners. Not because I need rescuing or you need redemption, but because we're better together than apart. I want to build something that lasts beyond us. A home, a family, a legacy." She set down the beadwork. "But I need to know if you want the same thing, if you're ready for that." Silas thought about Margaret, about the love they'd shared. For years, he'd believed that loving her meant never loving anyone else, that moving forward would somehow betray her memory. But holding on to grief hadn't honored her. It had just made him alone. "I'm ready," he said quietly, "not to replace what I had, but to build something new with you. Then ask me properly." Silas stood, went to the small wooden box where he kept his few valuables. He pulled out a silver ring, simple and unadorned, the one Margaret had worn. He'd kept it all these years, unable to part with it, but unable to wear it. He knelt in front of Aida, joints protesting the movement, and held up the ring. "This was my wife's. I loved her with everything I had, and when she died, I thought that part of my life was over. But you've shown me that hearts can grow large instead of smaller, that there's room for more than one great love in a lifetime." He took a breath. "Aida, will you marry me? Will you help me build a life worth leaving behind?" She took the ring, turned it in the firelight, then slipped it onto her finger. Perfect fit. "Yes, but under one condition." "Name it." "We do this right. Apache ceremony and Christian ceremony both. My people and your people joined together. No more hiding, no more halfway. We make a statement that love doesn't care about bloodlines or history. That'll cause talk. Let it. We've survived worse than gossip. They married in spring of 1877 on the first warm day after the last frost. Judge Carrington officiated the Christian ceremony in the new church that Dry Creek had built, packed to capacity with citizens who'd come to witness something they'd never seen before. A white man and an Apache woman standing before God and community, claiming each other as equals. The Apache ceremony followed at sunset, conducted by an elder from a reservation 3 days' ride away. He'd come reluctantly, suspicious of white intentions, but Ayita had convinced him. They stood in a circle of stones as the elder blessed them in the old language, binding their wrists with blue cloth, offering prayers to the spirits of their ancestors. Silas felt strange participating in rituals he didn't fully understand, but he saw the tears on Ayita's face and understood that this was healing something deep inside her, reclaiming traditions that violence had tried to erase. That night, truly married in all the ways that mattered, they lay together in the darkness and talked about the future. "I want children," Ayita said. "I know that's asking a lot. You've already been a father, already lost a son, but I want to create life, to prove that destruction doesn't have the final word." "I want that too," Silas replied. "Want to give you the family that was taken from you. Not to replace them, nothing could replace them, but to honor them by building something new." 9 months later, Daniel Blackwood was born. He came into the world screaming, healthy and strong, with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes. Silas held his son for the first time at age 38, feeling the weight of this small life, understanding with sudden clarity that this was what James Keller's watch had meant. This was legacy, not the absence of mistakes, but the presence of something worth protecting. They named him Daniel after Silas's first son, with Ayita's full blessing. "Your boy should live on," she'd said, "through name and through the love you give this child." 2 years later came Sarah, named for Ayita's mother, a daughter with her father's stubbornness and her mother's quiet strength. The cabin that had once felt too large now rang with children's laughter, with the chaos of family. Tommy Wilson, now 17 and a skilled blacksmith in his own right, helped expand the forge. More apprentices came. Boys who'd heard that Silas Blackwood would teach anyone willing to work hard, regardless of background or circumstance. The forge became a kind of school, producing not just horseshoes and tools, but young men who understood the value of patience and precision. Years passed in the steady accumulation of small moments. Daniel's first steps, Sarah's first words, the harvest festivals where Ayita's cooking became legendary. The winter storms weathered together. The slow building of trust between cultures as people saw that a mixed family could thrive. Not everyone accepted it. There were still those who muttered about miscegenation, who refused to do business with Silas, who spat when Ayita walked by. But they were fewer each year, and their children often thought differently than their parents. In 1885, when Daniel was 8 and Sarah was 6, a man appeared at the forge. He was in his early 50s, well-dressed, riding an expensive horse. His resemblance to Zeke Morrison was unmistakable. "I'm Jacob Morrison," he announced, Ezekiel's older brother. Silas set down his hammer, wiped his hands, and faced this new threat calmly. "What do you want?" "My brother died in prison 3 months ago, killed in a fight over a card game. Before he died, he sent me a letter. Told me about you, about the Apache woman, about everything that happened. I'm sorry for your loss, but if you're here for revenge, I'm not." Jacob dismounted, stood with his hands visible and empty. "Zeke was my brother and I loved him. But I'm not blind. He was a cruel, greedy man who got what he deserved. I just wanted to see the people who brought him down. Wanted to understand what kind of man risks everything for a stranger." They talked for 2 hours. Jacob asked questions about the trial, about the fire, about the years since. He asked about Ayita, about the children, about how they'd made it work. Silas answered honestly, leaving nothing out. Finally, Jacob stood to leave. He extended his hand. "My brother was wrong. About you, about her, about everything. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing." Silas shook his hand. "Took courage to come here and say that. Took courage to pull that trigger in Dry Creek. Seems like we both understand what courage costs." He rode away, and Silas never saw him again. But he told the story to Daniel and Sarah that night, teaching them that people could surprise you, that healing sometimes came from unexpected places. The years accumulated into decades. Daniel grew into a skilled blacksmith, eventually taking over more of the forge work as Silas's arthritis worsened. Sarah married a doctor from Tucson, gave Silas and Aida 3 grandchildren. The cabin expanded again, adding rooms, growing with the family. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Silas and Aida traveled back to Arizona for the first time in 15 years. They rode out to the site of Aida's village, the place where 83 people had died and 1 young woman had survived. The land had reclaimed it. Mesquite and creosote grew where tipis had stood. Wind whispered through the grass where children had played. Nothing remained to mark the tragedy except memory. Aida walked the perimeter slowly, touching trees, kneeling to feel the earth. Silas stayed back, letting her have this moment. Finally, she stood in the center of where the village had been and sang, an Apache song for the dead, her voice carrying across the empty land. When she finished, her face was wet with tears, but her expression was peaceful. "I've been carrying them with me all these years," she said when Silas joined her. "My family, my people, carrying them like stones. But I think it's time to set them down. Not forget them, never forget them, but let them rest. They'd be proud of you, of what you've built, of what we've built, you and me together. A family that honors them by proving love is stronger than hate." They rode back to Wyoming slowly, taking their time. 2 people in the autumn of their lives who'd learned that the journey mattered more than the destination. Now, in 1911, with snow falling outside and his grandson listening with wide-eyed eyes, Silas reached the end of his story. "So you see, Henry, one moment can change everything. One choice to stand up instead of walking away. That shot in Dry Creek gave me back my life. Gave me your grandmother, your father, you." Henry looked at the pocket watch Silas still held. "Is that why you carry it? To remember? To remember that every life matters, that the boy who died shouldn't have, and that honoring his memory means trying to do better, means standing up when it's hard. Will you give it to me someday?" "I'm giving it to you now." Silas pressed the watch into Henry's hands. "You're old enough to understand what it means, to carry it forward." Henry held the watch carefully, feeling the weight of history and responsibility. "What should I do with it?" "Live a life worth leaving behind. Be brave when it matters. Be kind always. And pass these stories to your children, so they remember where they came from and why it matters." Aida stood, moved to the window. "Come here, Henry, look." The boy joined her, and she pointed into the snowy darkness. Lights glowed from houses scattered across the valley. Their son, Daniel's home, where 3 more grandchildren slept. Sarah's house when she visited from Tucson. Homes of former apprentices who'd built lives nearby. A community that had grown from one moment of courage. "This is what that shot created," Aida said softly. "Not just our family, but all of this. People who learned that difference doesn't have to mean division. That a white man and an Apache woman could build something beautiful together, and that beauty could spread." She turned to face her grandson. "You carry Apache blood and European blood both. Some people will hate you for that, but you also carry the best of both worlds. Your grandfather's stubborn courage, my people's resilience. Use those gifts to make the world better." Henry nodded solemnly, understanding that he was receiving more than a watch. He was receiving a legacy, a responsibility, a story that now belonged to him to carry forward. Later that night, after Henry had gone to bed, Silas and Aida sat together in the firelight. 35 years of marriage, of partnership, of building a life from the ashes of loss. "Are you happy?" Silas asked. It was a question he still needed answered, even after all these years. "Yes, not every moment, not every day, but overall, when I look at what we've created." She squeezed his hand. "Yes, I'm happy. I love you. I know I don't say it enough, but you say it every day. In the way you look at me, the way you support my teaching, the way you honor my people's traditions even when you don't fully understand them. Words are just one way of speaking love." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 old warriors who'd fought their battles and earned their peace. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, making everything clean and new. Silas thought about that September day in Dry Creek, the impossible shot, the woman standing with an apple on her head and dignity in her spine. Thought about every choice that had led from that moment to this one. The cabin burned and rebuilt. The trial, the wedding, the children, the grandchildren, the slow accumulation of days that added up to a life. If he could go back, knowing everything that would follow, would he still take that shot? Yes, 1,000 times yes. Because some moments are worth every risk. Some people are worth fighting for. And sometimes, in the space between certainty and catastrophe, you find exactly what you were meant to build. Tell me, Aida said quietly, when you die, what do you want people to remember? Silas considered this, that I made mistakes but tried to fix them, that I loved well, that when it mattered most, I chose courage over comfort. That's a good legacy. What about you? What do you want to be remembered for? I want people to know that being destroyed doesn't mean staying broken, that you can lose everything and still build something beautiful, that love is always worth the risk. She rested her head on his shoulder. And I want them to know that an Apache woman and a blacksmith from Missouri created something that lasted, that our story mattered. It does matter. It will matter. I know, because we're not finished yet. We still have time to make it mean even more. And so they did. For 4 more years, they lived fully, teaching grandchildren, welcoming great-grandchildren, watching their legacy spread like roots through fertile ground. When Silas Blackwood died in 1915 at age 76, the funeral stretched for hours. People came from 3 territories to pay respects. Former apprentices, now master craftsmen themselves. Tommy Wilson stood at the front, now 49 and running the finest forge in Wyoming, tears streaming down his weathered face for the man who'd given him a second chance. Students Aida had taught, now teachers in their own right. Children of mixed heritage who'd grown up knowing that love could bridge any divide. Aida lived 5 more years, dying peacefully in her sleep at age 69, surrounded by family. They buried her next to Silas, on the Wyoming hillside where they'd built their last home, under a stone that read simply, Aida Blackwood, warrior, teacher, mother, beloved. But their story didn't end with their deaths. It lived on in the pocket watch Henry carried until his own death in 1963, then passed to his daughter, then her son. It lived in the schools that taught Apache and English side by side, in the laws that slowly, painfully, expanded to protect the rights they'd fought for, in every marriage that crossed the lines society tried to draw. And it lived in the simple truth that one moment of courage, one impossible shot, one choice to stand when it would have been easier to walk away, could echo through generations. In the end, that was the real legacy, not the shot itself, but what came after. The family built on love instead of law. The bridges constructed between divided peoples. The proof that human beings, given the chance, could choose connection over separation, courage over comfort, hope over hate. That was the story Silas Blackwood had told his grandson on a snowy Wyoming evening in 1911. And it was the story that would be told and retold, changing slightly with each telling, growing into legend, until the specific details mattered less than the truth at its heart. That kindness is always worth the risk. That justice is always worth the fight. And that love, real love, can redeem almost anything.